Summer can be a bit of a slog. For us, it's often for some reason a rather busy time, and I'm sure we're not alone.
Well, you can beat the summertime sadness and the August angst and enhance your everyday with our excellent sponsor, Via Hemp. This is a company that crafts award-winning premium THC and THC-free gummies.
Each of these gummies is especially designed to cultivate a specific mood. Whether you're looking to get relaxed, get quality sleep, get creative, or just to get focused. If you're 21 or older, you can experience it for yourself and get 15% off your first order with our exclusive code IMSHEET at viahemp.com. That's VIIAHEMP.com.
I personally enjoyed their grapefruit flow state gummies. This CBG and CBD powerhouse really helped me tap into my productivity. Like, we have had an extremely busy summer, and I feel flow state got me over the finish line a few times when I was editing multiple episodes a day, digging through documents, and knocking out a bunch of interviews.
Via Hemp does not require a medical card, and it ships legally to all 50 states. It's also affordable, and even more so for Murdersheet listeners who get a special deal.
If you're 21 and older, head to viahemp.com and use code MSHEET to receive 15% off. That's VIIAHEMP.com and use code MSHEET at checkout. After you purchase, they ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Enhance your everyday with Via.
This episode is sponsored by AutoTrader. Credit scores, down payments, interest rates. Car buying can be a numbers game, but you don't have to be a math expert to get the keys to your dream car. Just use Kelley Blue Book My Wallet on AutoTrader. Crunch your numbers and get your personalized results so you know exactly how much you'll pay each month for your car. It's like having a magic wand for your wallet. Presto! The car you've been wanting is now within reach. So hit the road and leave your calculator at home. Find your next car on autotrader.com.
Content warning. This episode contains discussion of the murder of 2 children.
Hi, everybody. This is Anya from the Murdersheet. Today, we will be doing an episode on the latest defense filing. It's got some really pretty bombshell pieces of information in it. So we'll be discussing and talking about it. You're going to hear a lot from me in this episode and not as much from my wonderful co-host, Kevin Greenlee. He is actually in the process of recovering from a surgery right now. Everything's okay. But when you hear him, he'll sound a little bit more ragged than normal. He's just healing right now, but he still wanted to participate in the episode because he is a trooper.
And I did write some notes that if Anya will be kind enough to share.
Yes, we're going to be getting the Kevin insights just delivered by me. So it's going to be an odd experience for everyone, but
She'll be my puppet today.
yeah, I'm going to be his ventriloquist dummy like from the musical Chicago. So we're going to try to do it, but that's what's going to be happening.
Bear with us with my apologies.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murdersheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're the Murdersheet.
And this is The Delphi Murders. More confessions. So, as you could probably tell from the title of this episode, the biggest bombshell that this document, which is the memorandum of law in support of defendant Allen's motion to suppress, is going to have to do with the fact that we have now learned that there are multiple confessions from Richard Allen in this case. We'll be breaking down exactly what we've learned. I'll just say that Kevin and I tend to have an approach with these things where whether it's a defense filing, a judge's filing, or a prosecutorial filing, we almost kind of try to separate out the ingredients, get rid of the spin, and really delve into the facts revealed by whatever filing. So this is a good opportunity to do that, because the defense's job is to sort of spin the facts as favorably to their client as possible. But when you kind of peer through the veil, a different story starts to emerge somewhat. And so we're going to be diving into this. I will say a lot of it may read as repetitive for folks who are following this, because there's a lot of repeated complaints about conditions in Westville and whatnot. So, I think some folks might kind of start reading it and think, oh, this is just the same thing. It's not. There's a lot in here, and we're going to get to it now. I think to start out, I know, Kevin, you highlighted the following quotes, and I'm going to read them quickly. So, quote, "Through this process," and what we're talking about is the process of the attorneys holding depositions. So through this process, Alan's attorneys have learned that Alan has been accused of making incriminating statements to both inmates and guards. Nearly all of these statements appear to have occurred between mid-March of 2023 and June of 2023. During this time frame, there also exists medical/psychiatric records suggesting that Alan was in a state of psychosis.
So that's interesting because it highlights, previously we'd heard about confessions to his wife and mother. And now we're finding that not only did he confess to them, but he confessed to fellow inmates and guards. And nearly all, but not all, of these statements took place between March and June of last year.
So that means that there are more that did not take place between that time frame. So that's shocking. This is shocking. I know that when it came out that Alan had confessed to his wife and mother a long time ago, that was a pretty big deal. That ended up becoming a pretty widely talked about moment. Now we're hearing that that was not the end of it. That was not the extent of it. In fact, he has been confessing to different people while incarcerated for months. So, yeah, this is a big deal. Let me get to the next part of the quote. Alan's defense team has learned that Alan was not only detained in an isolation cell in WCU, which refers to the isolation unit at Westville, but that prison officials chose to post inmates at Alan's door and required the inmates to keep logs of all of Alan's actions, statements, and behaviors. This appears to have occurred during all hours of the day and continued over the course of much of Alan's stay in the WCU. These inmates, all of whom are convicted felons, were not only actively engaged in surveying Alan's activities, but were also communicating with him from time to time. Alan's attorneys have also learned that at some point in early April of 2023, prison officials deliberately pulled the inmates from Alan's cell door, and replaced them with prison guards. Alan's attorneys have learned that this appears to have been prompted by an inmate or inmates engaging Alan regarding his pending charges and communicating Alan's thoughts or words to the families of these inmates, thereby violating any sense of confidentiality that might exist within the walls of the penitentiary.
There's a couple things I wanted to mention there. They seem to, it makes it sound a little bit odd, if not menacing, that they choose to station inmates outside his door. But there was a reason for that, wasn't there?
He was on suicide watch. It's our understanding that companion inmates who are inmates that have essentially earned a level of trust within the system to the point where they can go do jobs like this, who are stationed outside of the inmate's cell and are basically watching them to ensure that they do not commit suicide. So at some point after it was revealed that the Westville system operated this way, they seemingly switched it out for guards. So that's what I want to say. This makes the Odinist guard thing makes so much more sense to me. You're trying to discredit the guards and the system as a whole and saying, well, the vast Odinist conspiracy actually reaches within the prison in the form of these guards. So if you can do that, then you can, you can disrupt the effectiveness of guards who are coming forward to say that he is confessing to these crimes to us. So it makes that strategy, it lays that strategy a bit more bare. I still think it's a bad strategy because it sounds like they do not have any real concrete indication that these guards even were Odinists as opposed to heathens, which, as we've talked about on the show multiple times, not the same thing. But beyond that, it does make more sense because they're just trying to basically get these additional confessions thrown out or put into disarray in front of a jury.
And then I wanted to also highlight, they talk about the inmates repeating things to other people that they hear, and that this violates any sense of confidentiality that might exist within the walls of the penitentiary. Is there a sense of confidentiality that exists within the walls of the penitentiary?
Penitentiary?
Sorry, I'm not feeling my best.
You're fine.
Because it's not like your fellow inmates are your attorney or your doctor. I'm not sure if I'm incarcerated and I say something to a fellow inmate, I really have that much expectation of privacy.
I don't know what the heck they're getting at here. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It's like maybe they're making the argument that, well, these people are tasked with ensuring his mental health to some extent, so therefore they have some sort of responsibility to keep what he says confidential. I don't understand how they get there. These are inmates. They're not state actors. They may have been basically assigned prison roles, but I think they pretty much have the right to do whatever the heck they want.
With that said, I think I can imagine some hypothetical situations where they might become state actors if Tony Liggett or Jerry Holman go and talk to an inmate and say, I want you on my behalf to go ask Richard Allen these 5 questions. And then the inmate goes and asks Richard Allen those 5 questions without an attorney present. That sounds like being a state actor.
Right. So anyone can become a state actor. And that's a really good point to make, by taking on a state assignment, essentially. And so if that were to be true, then that would definitely become more controversial and make this more likely to be thrown out. In this document, they don't make any allegations of that sort. That like, oh, Nick McClellan put these inmates up to it. That becomes a time when we're getting into different territory. They're not making those allegations, but it is important to note that if those allegations were to come up, then that would be more serious. I think that would be more serious for the prosecution of possibly getting some of this tossed out.
Yeah,
because they would have had to Mirandize him, essentially, right? Or be designated as state actors.
If they're doing an interrogation of someone at the behest of law enforcement and that person's lawyer is not present, that's a problem.
It's a huge problem.
But I haven't seen in this document any evidence that that's what was happening.
And if they're just people who have a slightly, elevated job within a prison setting because they've earned trust through the system, then I don't see why the heck they would need to keep anything confidential, and why wouldn't they be able to tell their families? I mean, they have free speech. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. It sounds like they're trying to just make it sound like it's something it wasn't.
I'm also not clear, and this may be because I'm not feeling my best, but I'm not clear as if an inmate hears Richard Allen make a confession and then the inmate shares this with his own family, how does that damage Richard Allen?
I guess they don't want it out there that he's telling everyone he committed the crimes. I guess. I mean, they don't want the public knowing that he, they want to be able to explain it to the public. They don't want the public just unilaterally knowing that he's been confessing to killing 2 kids. So
I don't see those inmates' family members getting on CBS Evening News.
No.
And spreading it.
Or on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't either. Yeah, I think there's a desperation with this defense team at this point to kind of, like everything is a leak. Everything is a leak to them. Look, that looks like a leak. That's a leak. It's sort of like
that's their way of minimizing
their own leak. Yeah, I mean, they're the team with the documented leak that ultimately resulted in graphic photos of the bodies of these children being sent to family members by a YouTuber who also posted them on YouTube. That's the culmination of their leak.
And also in their leak, a man took his own life.
Mm-hmm. So when you're kind of up against that, I guess maybe to try to minimize your own responsibility for what happened, you see leaks where there seemingly are none. So moving on, they talk about how they deposed Warden John Gallipo, who's one of the witnesses at the hearing on the safekeeping order way back when. He contested a lot of what the defense said in the courtroom, noting, that essentially Richard Allen was being treated unusually well by Westville standards. And there was a lot of back and forth between him and Brad Rosie in trial. So they deposed him on March 22nd, 2024. And he said, Warden Gallup, so here, quote, Warden Gallipo acknowledged that during his entire tenure, he was unaware of any other circumstances involving the pretrial detention of a man who had not yet been convicted of a crime. Okay, that's interesting. So he's saying this is highly unusual. My understanding is that it is highly unusual, but I just wanted to point out that we just happened to be covering another case where this happens. This exact same thing happened, where in the murder of Laurel Jean Mitchell, a 1975 cold case out of North Webster, Indiana, 2 men, Fred Bandy and John Wayne Lehman, were recently arrested for that. So John Wayne Lehman, for physical health-related reasons, was transferred to the Miami Correctional Facility, which is a prison, pending trial. Seems like a somewhat similar argument was made because for physical health versus Allen with mental health, in terms of like, we need somewhere with the resources to take care of him. So while this is highly unusual, obviously if we can easily find another case, then that tells me that it's not unheard of. That being said, I think one area where it does differ is I've not seen any indication that Lehman was put under some sort of segregation or in some sort of segregation unit. So that is a different circumstance. He may have been, it's just not clear to me that he was. But obviously, given Allen's the possibility of suicide, as well as behavior that we're going to get into later in this filing, it's not necessarily surprising that he was kept segregated. Also, the fact that he is accused of killing 2 children in a very highly publicized case, that's kind of puts a target on your back when you're in any sort of incarcerated setting, I think. So, branching off on this, let's read this next quote. They're talking about the conditions, and a lot of this is incredibly repetitive from previous filings, so we're going to skip over most of that, but they do talk about the reception he received from other inmates incarcerated with him. So, quote, Allen's attorneys have learned that he was referred to as a baby killer, and that he was the target of other similar accusations during his stay in the WCU. So that seems to be their attempt to kind of like show how something like that would hurt your mental health, which, I imagine it would. It is important to remember that child predators are considered the lowest of the low in prison. They are the lowest people in the hierarchy that develops within a prison. So people who go after kids are frequently targeted for violence. And obviously in this case, we've seen people, it doesn't sound like they're threatening him, but they're certainly labeling him as a child murderer, which is a dangerous thing to be labeled as when you're incarcerated. So it's interesting that they included this, because to me, this kind of like highlights the reason why you would not want him in Gen Pop and general population in a prison, or frankly in a county jail, because I don't really think that inmates in either of those settings would be like more inclined to invite him to a tea party. I think that he would be in physical danger potentially if he was in either setting. And I think that the isolation unit, I mean, the WCU seems like a way to keep him safe until trial. Now, there can be really damaging, detrimental effects to being that isolation. I just don't feel like there's a really good answer for him, because if you say, no, yeah, go interact with people, then he gets shivved in Gen Pop, then that's obviously not good either. If he gets attacked in jail by people who don't like people who are accused of killing kids. That's a problem. I think at some point there has to be a look at what is the least bad option. So I don't know. So going to the next section we wanted to highlight, this gets into Alan's mental health. So they kind of recap the Odinist theory and, okay, there's Odinist guards and it's all part of this thing. But one thing they get into is actually Alan himself. Alan himself has almost like become like a real enigma at the heart of this case. There's not a lot of information that's been dug up about him, at least as far as we've seen, and certainly not a lot that's verifiable or has been verified. When we talked to people who knew him, they described a quiet man who could be funny, but kind of kept to himself. And, that kind of makes it hard to say, like, well, did he give off creepy vibes? Did he ever do anything to another kid that was suspicious? What happened? Was he just totally normal? Whatever that means. But now his attorneys themselves are kind of getting more into some of his mental health history. So I'm going to read this. Quote, Alan has also battled depression throughout most of his adult life. He was medicated over the course of his life and, in fact, has sought out therapeutic resources to treat and manage his depression. The IDOC, Indiana Department of Correction, gave very little consideration to Alan's condition at the time of his intake and initial incarceration in the WCU, especially given the unusual circumstances in which he was detained.
So this was interesting to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it seems like a diagnosis of depression certainly would make it more understandable as to why he would be put on suicide watch.
Yeah.
And then secondly, depression is one of those things you hear a lot about, but maybe you're not aware of all of the symptoms and what it may mean. Now, I understand that not everybody with depression would have all of the symptoms of depression. Maybe you just have some of the symptoms and not the others. But with that in mind, I was curious and I went to the Mayo Clinic site and looked up what kind of symptoms you might see with men who have depression. And Anya is going to be kind enough to read that.
Absolutely. So this is what the Mayo Clinic says. Quote, like women with depression, men with depression may feel sad, hopeless, or empty, feel very tired, have a hard time sleeping or sleep too much, not get pleasure from activities usually enjoyed. Other behaviors in men that could be symptoms of depression include problems getting along with others, including your spouse or partner and other family members, escapist behaviors such as spending a lot of time at work or on sports, physical symptoms such as headaches, digestive problems, and pain, problems with alcohol or drug use, controlling, violent, or abusive behavior, irritability or anger that gets out of control, risky behavior such as reckless driving. That's very interesting.
That's very interesting. We don't know which symptoms Alan had or has.
Yeah, I'd be very curious about how did his depression manifest itself over the course of his life? Was this something that was only really witnessed by close family members and friends in his life? Was this something that was overt? Did he engage in risky behaviors or any sort of violent, abusive behaviors? Did he cope with alcohol or drugs? Did he just simply kind of deal with the traditional sad, hopeless emptiness or feeling tired or things like that? We don't know the answer to this.
We don't know, and we certainly don't want to stigmatize everyone with depression.
No. Well, it's a serious issue, and this is something that's very common for people to have. It's not a rare diagnosis, I think, by any means. And just because he was depressed does certainly not mean he is guilty of a violent crime. But it is interesting to look into the symptoms of depression as far as men are concerned, because it can manifest itself a little differently, depending on the person. It's not a cookie cutter diagnosis where it's like one set of symptoms fits all. it's just different for different people.
This certainly explains why Prosecutor McClelland is so interested in getting the mental health records.
Yeah, it really does. And my recollection is when we talked to some wonderful mental health experts about this case, they noted that in some cases, I think there can be some kind of link when it comes to depression and psychosis. So that's not necessarily... it would have to be a pretty severe form of depression, is my understanding in most cases, but there can be some link there. So it's not unheard of. And I just am curious when they say like no consideration was given to his depression. What does that mean? Because it sounds like they put him on suicide watch, possibly in part because of that reason.
Yeah, that's certainly my impression.
Yeah. And again, like, it sort of just feels like a lot of this is like the defense attorney is making everything so like people are damned if they do or they damned if they don't. If they put him in Gen Pop or they didn't put him on suicide watch and he was hurt as a result of that, I imagine that would also be a pretty severe and terrible outcome and bad from their perspective as well. So I don't really know, suicide watch means watching people, and they complain a lot about how he's being watched. And I imagine that's a very uneasy feeling, but that is kind of the purpose of suicide watch, no?
Yeah.
Anyways, so moving on, we get to some very telling statements from the defense that I think you wanted to highlight. So this is the quote. Here, Alan's free will was overcome by the forces of his environment, all of which were placed upon him by the government and its actors.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight that because I think it's always important when we look at these filings to try to highlight the arguments being made. And their contention, basically, to oversimplify, is that all of the confessions that were made were the result of bad treatment of one kind or another, and therefore they should be thrown out because he lost his free will as a result of them. It's
like if to use an example, like if let's say the government like tortured somebody into confessing for days and days and days, and then they confessed to a crime, they would have lost their free will essentially because of the torture, right?
Yes. They cite a case where there's a problem with somebody because he was subjected to long hours long interrogation and may not have been in a good mental state. And they said basically Richard Allen was under an interrogation situation for 5 months. So I don't know how compelling that argument is, but that's the argument. He was put in an untenable environment similar to torture where his free will is gradually taken away from him because of this awful treatment. And since Judge Gull has already reviewed most, if not all, of this treatment and indicated she thought it was actually better than the treatment received by many people at Westville, I'm not sure how compelling she would find that argument. I think that's the argument being made.
Yeah, that does seem to be the argument being made, and I understand in the generality of it, talking about how essentially, at the end of the day, he is in this prison because of the government and its actors. So, like, I understand, like, macro-wise, like, he doesn't make these confessions unless he's in this prison, and he's there because of the government. That being said, it feels like at times they try to label the people he's confessing to as state actors as well. Obviously, in the case of the guards, they're employed by the state of Indiana. But in the case of the inmates, I think that becomes, I don't think they owe him any confidentiality.
And then what about his confessions to his wife and his mother? They're certainly not state actors. But I think the argument is Richard Allen has been beaten down, at least metaphorically, to such an extent that he's lost his free will and is basically confessing to everybody. I think that would be the argument.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's interesting. I I will be very curious to see how this plays out, but I think we're going to get into some more information about what exactly these confessions may have contained. And
but first, we have another line I wanted to highlight about his free will being broken down.
Absolutely. So this gets into, they've talked about how basically his depression wasn't properly treated, which again, they don't really give any specific information. They do note that he was put into suicide watch pretty quickly, which indicates that they were taking the issue of depression seriously. So this is the quote. Quote, all of this occurred while Alan's medications were being adjusted by the prison medical team, combination of which factors reduced him to nothing more than a human experiment. Alan's free will was overcome.
This is a very, very bold claim. And I say that because let's translate it. They're essentially claiming, with no offered evidence as far as I could see, that licensed medical professionals would violate their sworn duties and responsibilities to their patients and therefore jeopardize their license and their entire career that they've worked so hard for to perform an experiment on a patient. So that if you make a claim like that, you better have some evidence to back it up. Otherwise, it reminds me of the line in the first Frank's memo where they say, well, maybe guards pressured him to making confessions. Now that we know this, we're just guessing. And it sounds like for their conspiracy to work, you need Odinist guards and now I guess Odinist doctors who are willing to lose their careers over this case.
That's a very well... I didn't even pick that up on the first read because I'm so used and I've been so, like, I guess, trained by this defense team to just, like, keep reading through what is often incredibly... how do I say this? Bold and forceful language, I guess. And not bold and forceful that in a way that is always backed up by facts seemingly, but is more of like basically written in a way to shock. Shock value seems to be very important. If you put two descriptions of an event, one of which was more accurate but less flashy, and one of which was incredibly flashy, but maybe boiled it down to a point where like it actually kind of lost any meaning before this defense team, I think they would pick the latter because that's just been par for the course here. Just basically style over substance. And I think that has hurt them again and again, to be honest.
If a doctor were to experiment on a patient to remove that patient's free will in order to extract confessions for him, you lose your license. That's not why you become a doctor. That's not why you go to med school. It's a bold claim, and I would really need to see a lot more evidence to actually back that up. Right now, the only reason I see to believe that is because it would be convenient to their case. And you need more than that before you smear the names of this med team.
Well, they don't. I mean, they haven't for anything. And this is why, you know, I'm at a point where in our reporting on this, I'm not going to necessarily just take the word of the defense team from a filing to jump to any conclusions. I've done that before. I think if I got this filing
3 months ago,
I would have been like, wow, this is explosive. Here we go. I mean, it would have been a really big deal to me personally. But again, we've had things like Turca. We've had time and time again when there's been any other analysis of what's going on or other people describing their own experiences with this defense team. It's been exaggeration to the point of like stretching the truth until it snaps. And I'm just not willing to really, I guess, necessarily take their word for anything unless I'm seeing, you know, additional corroboration. That's where I am. So I guess going back to this, are we at a point where we need to talk about what is a very disturbing description of Alan's mental health within this?
Yeah, there's
setting?
a long quote here you're going to read for us.
Yeah, and I'll just warn you, it's pretty horrifying stuff. So, quote, already suffering from a bona fide mental health disorder and then having been cut off from the moral support of his wife, mother, and daughter, Alan was weakened to the point where he slipped into a state of psychosis, plagued with grossly disorganized, delusional, paranoid, and highly dysfunctional behavior. These behaviors were manifested through verbal confessions that he may have been drugged, verbal confessions to the double homicide, inconsistent with the known facts about the crime scene, periods of not sleeping for days, paranoia, stripping off his clothes, drinking toilet water, covering himself with and eating his own feces, and many other socially unacceptable behaviors. On one occasion, Alan confessed to molesting those 2 young girls and shooting them in the back. On another occasion, he professed his sorrow for molesting Abby, Libby, and others, which he specifically named. These facts are known to be falsities, none of which are supported by the autopsy findings by Dr. Roland Core as the cause of the death of the girls, and unsupported by the absence of any evidence that either one of the girls was sexually assaulted near or before the time of their deaths. At the time Alan uttered these falsities, the state's actors were in the ready position with pen in hand, documenting the entirety of Alan's mental and physical deterioration and actions stemming therefrom. The infringements on Alan's legal rights didn't stop there. Inmate companions then spread the good word of Alan's confessions to inmates and general population at Westville, prompting these inmates to then share the information with their respective family members in public. Proof of these leaks were offered up by the state in the form of audio-recorded interviews and accompanying transcripts, and included in large volumes of discovery dumps received by the defense in the recent past. However, neither Alan nor his legal team are aware of any self-reporting of said leaks by the state to the defense or by the state to the court, despite the fact that the state was aware of this information as early as May 12, 2023, when Patton and Elliott were interviewed by law enforcement investigators. Alan's due process rights have been all but ignored. So just as a side note, Jason Elliott and Lacey Patton are 2 of the inmates who apparently heard confessions from Alan.
You looked them up, didn't you?
I did. They're both inmates at Westville. Lacey Patton, his sentencing occurred over the crime of intimidation, and he is from Elkhart, I guess, and he seemingly could be, seeing a release relatively soon. So that's one of them. And then the other, Jason Elliott, also at Westville, he has a number of charges. The most recent gets into possession of methamphetamine. And he has a release date in a couple of years. So those are the 2 people who are kind of associated with this, at least in this document.
So let's start by jumping back to the beginning.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Let's start by jumping back to the beginning of what you read, which was a description of, shall we say, unusual behavior by Richard Allen. Frankly, it seems to me that type of behavior seems to justify the conditions under which Allen is held, that you need to keep an eye on a person who is doing these sorts of things to monitor and ensure his mental health and ensure that he's not harming himself.
Yeah, they complain endlessly about the facets of suicide watch and the facets of isolation, and then they basically explain why that is occurring. I don't see why you would have someone who is doing this, who is smearing themselves and eating their own feces in Gen Pop, or, I mean, that just seems like if he is exhibiting a mental health crisis, or if he's exhibiting the behaviors associated with one, then I think it would be deeply irresponsible to not have him on suicide watch and to not have him be isolated so that he can't hurt others and that they can't hurt him.
And then when it comes to these confessions, they're highlighting here certain details about the murders that he talks about that appear to be inconsistent with the actual facts, like the girls being shot, according to him, when they weren't shot. This is obviously done to make us feel that the confessions as a whole are not credible. And we will return to that in a minute, but I think you wanted to talk about the molestation angle.
Okay, so the molestation angle really stood out to me when I first read this. I think there is, I guess this is going to sound like the understatement of the year, but there is a stigma against being a pedophile and against being specifically a child predator, a child molester in our society. That's not, that's not a good thing as far as anyone is concerned. So someone opting to take on the label of child molester to me is highly significant. In cases where there is child molestation, you often have perpetrators trying to kind of get around it by making excuses or dodging that label, a label that Richard Allen seems all too ready to embrace. I think that's really shocking that he's essentially identifying himself as somebody who is attracted to children, because why would that happen? Why would you do that? Why would you claim that? I can understand, I guess from a personal perspective, I can understand being incredibly depressed and being on a phone call with your wife and mother and telling them, you know what, I did it. And you know what, maybe you didn't. Maybe you're totally innocent of it, but maybe you just want your loved ones to move on with their lives and forget you because you feel so bad about the agony that your situation is putting them through. To me, that might speak to some sort of depression or some sort of self-loathing or some sort of, mental health issue. But adopting the label of child molester, saying that you've molested kids, I don't know what the reason would be to say that. I don't understand that at all.
And I want to say that the detail about him molesting young Abby and young Libby prior to killing them, I'm not sure if that is a false detail, because I think a lot of these things depend on how you define molestation or how you define sexual assault. We know that prior to the killer taking the lives of these two children, he made them strip. And presumably that was for some sort of sexual gratification. So maybe to the mind of the person who did that, that would constitute molestation.
There are cases where a perpetrator goes out to sexually assault somebody, and then either because they fight back or because they panic or because because the victims fight back or because the perpetrator panics or just something goes wrong or they get to that point and they don't want to do it, they kill the victim instead. That's, the motivation seems to be, to me, in Delphi, sexual. The fact that they're naked is kind of the biggest clue to that. I don't think they need to have been sexually assaulted for this to be a sexually motivated crime in some way. And so kidnapping two young girls and then forcing them to strip in the woods and then killing them. I mean, is it traditional child molestation in that there's a sexual assault? No. But could it be something that a child molester does? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't know.
I was also struck by, they said that Richard Allen professed sorrow for molesting others whom he named, and said this is known to be false. And the obvious question is, how do we know that it is false that he molested these other people he says he molested?
Yes. Has the defense investigated that? Have they interviewed the other purported victims? Are the other purported victims in a place where they would feel even comfortable divulging the truth about what happened? I would just want to know. If they've basically gone through and done a very thorough investigation of their own and concluded that this couldn't have happened, then I'd be very interested in seeing their notes on that. But one thing I'm noting is that when they're talking about these are false, and then they say because the coroner said there was no sexual assault, but they don't get into why the other purported crimes could be false. So it is a lot easier to explain away one confession than it is to explain not only multiple confessions, but the fact that then you're saying essentially that you're a repeat child molester.
Then I found it interesting that their belief is that the inmates sharing this information with their family members is a leak that should have been immediately reported. I would actually be curious when the defense received recordings of these interviews, because I think it would help all of us determine if they have a valid complaint there.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting. Seems to me more, continuing to litigate their own leak.
And then I wanted to highlight what I think is arguably the single most important line in this entire document. As we said a moment ago, in their earlier discussions of the confessions, they're highlighting things like, oh, he said they were shot and they weren't shot, so these aren't even true. These are false confessions. He said he molested them, and we don't think they were molested, so false confessions. They're doing what they can to make it sound like the confessions he made were all false, with false information, which makes this line the most crucial line to me. They write, quote, "The truth or falsity of Allen's statements are of no consequence to this analysis." So, again, in this memorandum, they've been highlighting confessions Allen has made which they believe have false elements. This line suggests very, very clearly to me that other confessions have been made, confessions which may be wholly true. So it's interesting the defense is seeming to concede that some of the incriminating statements made by Richard Allen may very well be true. So I would be curious about those confessions, and do they contain details that only the killer would know?
Or is just the repetition and force of them enough to possibly be pretty convincing to a jury? It's a really good point, Kevin. I think you're good at weeding out some of the lawyerly language where it's like, oh, okay, this is what this means.
I also thought it was just worth noting that in this memorandum, they're talking about, they're making claims and talking about all of the confessions as a whole instead of talking about them separately. And what I would expect, what the judge would really need, would be some sort of list of each specific confession, along with an explanation of why each and every one of them individually needs to be thrown out.
Right.
Because I could imagine that maybe there are some confessions which should be thrown out, others which shouldn't be thrown out. So it's not an either everything or nothing situation. So I'm not clear why that wasn't done.
Yeah, that's a good question, because you would think that it's better to at least get a bunch of them thrown out than to, not get any, you might as well go for knocking off a few rocks off the pile than just kind of not trying at all. Do you think that they have any grounds to possibly get some of these convert? What do you think the outcome to this is going to be, I guess?
I need more information. If some of these inmates were acting at the behest of the state, if they were given specific questions to ask or things of that nature of Richard Allen, I'd have a problem with that. And maybe some of these confessions should be thrown out.
That makes sense.
I think you wanted to talk about jailhouse snitches in general.
Well, yeah. So this is something I've not been shy about saying on this show. I have an issue with jailhouse snitches. I have an issue with prison house snitches. I think in many cases, this kind of witness has been detrimental because in many situations, a jailhouse snitch or a prison house snitch may be incentivized in some ways to provide information beneficial to the state where none exists, basically making up. If you tell me, Anya, if you get any information from your bunkmate about this murder, then we can work out a deal with you to dismiss some of your serial thieving charges. I'm incentivized to hear things that didn't actually get said. So in general, that kind of evidence makes me uneasy. So I think the defense has that going in their favor, that I think people are increasingly skeptical of jailhouse and prison house testimony because there might be incentives. I think, but this remains a huge problem for them, seemingly because of the sheer quantity of incriminating statements. He is not telling one person this, who's then making a big deal of it, or one person could be making it up. He is seemingly telling everybody who will listen that what he did and what, his version of what he did and his version of his motives and this stuff and that. And, that's really problematic. In addition to that, it's not just people who are incarcerated or hearing these. It's the guards themselves. It's the people who work at this prison. They're hearing it too. And they make it clear that these confessions and these incriminating statements were to guards and inmates. That is a huge problem. Quantity and the fact that this occurred with both guards and inmates may supersede to a large degree, in my opinion, any uneasiness around jailhouse and prison house testimony. Now, this also, frankly, makes some of the behavior by the defense team make a little bit more sense. Why would you go for smearing guards as committed odinists who are part of some large statewide conspiracy when you could easily just say he had a mental health crisis and that's why he said those things? Well, if you want to also smear the guards to basically say, you can't trust these guys, they're odinists, or their colleagues are odinists, and they're part of this conspiracy. So it's a way, that kind of whole Odinist guard thing was seemingly a way to try to get ahead of these multiple confessions and smear essentially the staff at Westville in anticipation of them coming out and saying, he told us he did this. That's the what I read into that. I think that this document seems like they're trying to very much get ahead of this kind of incoming flood of confessions that he's done. And that makes sense. I will say this, that is good strategy by the defense, in my opinion. It's always better to put out your version of events first so you can spin it. So like if it's going to come out later that I was busted for a serial heist, it would be great if Kevin could go together, put together a statement or a filing about how desperate and hungry and sad I was and how I was going to give the cereal to orphans. Regardless of anything, if he can put his own spin on it to make me look better, that's good. If the prosecution puts out a filing about how I'm a heartless serial thief first, then that's not as good for me. So in terms of public perception, it's helpful to get things out first. And then I would say, telling your wife and mother that you did the crime in a recorded phone call, that's very bad. That's very, very bad. Because that's not a hulking interrogator who's trying to put you in jail. Those are people who support you. And you're telling them. It's exponentially worse to then go and repeatedly do this for months, even to the point where you're not just confessing to the crime at the heart of all this, you're confessing to other crimes, and you're labeling yourself as a child molester who's sexually interested in children. That goes beyond anything. I mean, that is just, it's going to be very difficult to reason that away. I mean, I would be curious about what mental health experts say. I don't know if a mental health crisis could fully excuse months and months of confessions, but I'd be interested in hear what the experts say, because we're not mental health experts, and perhaps there's some way that this is a symptom of a wider mental health issue that would make sense. But we do know that mental health professionals who assessed Alan at Westville, when it came to his really bad behavior, all basically said that he did not need further medication or forced medication, and that then he stopped his behavior. So one thing about mental health crises is like you can't control them typically. You can't just necessarily stop. So that the fact that he was able to at some point stop the bad behavior is notable to me. I would say on the surface, it seems to me that Alan is either a guilty man who in 2023 was desperately trying to do the right thing and confess, and that this may have been halted by the people in his life and his defense team, a defense team that is, of course, married to a very colorful, media-friendly actual innocence defense. And basically they diverted him. Or he is an innocent man who has for some reason opted to do everything he can in his power to get himself convicted, even to the point of labeling himself as a child molester. So either way, he has done himself significant damage at trial if any of this remains in. If the defense doesn't get this thrown out, this is going to hurt. And I don't know. If they get it thrown out, it'll help him. If they don't, then repeated confessions around this, even if he's bungling details at times, is going to be a hard thing for the jury to hear and then explain away, in my opinion.
Very well. Very well said. I want to thank everyone for listening and for being patient with me as I'm clearly far from my best. It's my earnest hope that by next week I'll be back to normal. Especially, I think we have 2 of the 3 episodes that are putting out next week are pre-recorded from before my surgery.
Oh, there you go. So if Kevin goes back to sounding normal fast, that's why.
But hopefully by next week's cheat sheet, I'll be back in fighting form.
I bet you will. And everyone, if you pray, say a little prayer for Kevin's recovery. And if you don't, just send good vibes.
And again, thank you so much for listening and for your patience with my sluggish performance. I'm going to go back to bed.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.